All right, good evening, everybody, and welcome to our second webinar. With me, we have Richard Laub, who's currently the CEO and founder of Dragon Sourcing, as well as Ben, who is CEO of House of Procurement. Now, we all know that COVID-19 has disrupted the supply chain, and a lot of the board members, as well as senior leadership, are asking, where is the money going to come from? We have identified the success of your business is currently linked to performance of your supply chain. Typically 30% to 90% of revenue is spent in the supply chain ignited by procurement. 4.5%. Total purchasing cost reduction has the same impact on profit as a 28% turnover increase. Is this true? And where is the money? Richard, I hope that this evening you'll be able to show us where the money sits within the supply chain space. So before we start our webinar, allow me to welcome Ben, who will give some introductory remarks. As usual, we request that you stay muted. During the question and answer session, we will unmute you and you can then be able to ask the questions. However, feel free as participants to post your questions in the chat room and we'll forward this to Richard, who will then be able to respond as he goes along. So, karibu sana, Ben.
Thank you very much. Richard, someone is flying a drone over your house?
Well, I've got my gardener who just showed up. You know, I'm confined in my house for the last 2 months. That's why I look a little bit like a wild beast coming out of his grotto. And the gardener just showed up to kind of mow my garden. So he's doing blasting away in my garden, but I can't even tell him to stop because he's got these headsets on and he can't even hear me. So, so hopefully he will soon stop. Hopefully he will soon stop.
So I'm gonna do a brief introduction. So it's Richard Laub. Richard Laub is a global supply chain procurement leader. He will briefly tell us about his journey, work in big consulting companies and one electronic company, among others. He is the founder and the CEO of Dragon Sourcing, who are leading sourcing organization in emerging markets, China. So as the name suggests, Dragon Sourcing. Dragon Sourcing and House of Procurement have a partnership for global sourcing across all those markets. So whether they are buying from Africa or supporting African organizations of all nature. And with this webinar, one of the most important things that we want to discuss today is the impact of global sourcing and procurement, for that matter, in saving and contributing value to businesses. A lot of organizations are always the lazy thing to do is cut on costs such as staff and marketing and consulting and training and all this. But what can procurement do in terms of actual cost savings, cash generation or inventory or whatever it is in the whole supply chain, and especially sourcing while the money goes, because that can be a direct contribution to the bottom line. And then what does global sourcing hold now? Do we still buy from China? Are we scared? Africa? What about Europe? And all those things. So let me hand it over to Richard, who will tell us briefly about himself, and then he will kick off the presentation. So Richard, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Bernard, and thank you for Rose for her introduction as well. So good evening to everybody who's participating. And apologies, as I said, for the strange noises you might hear in the background. I'm, like I said, working from home, not always easy because we have animals here, dogs and cats making funny noises. We have the gardener, we have my kids. So I'm just hoping we're not going to be too disrupted. So let me give you a quick intro about myself. I started my career with a consulting organization called Booz Allen in Hamilton, a large American consulting outfit. And I was a partner in the firm running their supply chain practice in Paris for several years. I then went to Philips to run the indirect procurement for them for several years in Holland. I then joined Accenture I'm sure you've heard of Accenture, the large consulting company as well. First to launch an internet company for them in the procurement space, and then to take the lead of their global sourcing practice for them on a global basis. And then finally, I left them and created Dragon Sourcing in 2005. So that's a quick intro about my background. Now let me share the screen with you so that we can go through the presentation. I just shared the screen, so I'm hoping, Rose, tell me if there's an issue, but I am hoping that everybody can now see.
Yes, we can see it, Richard. Go ahead.
That everybody can see the presentation, so that's good. So let me get it in landscape if I know how to make that work. There we go. Okay, so basically the topic for today is really, of course, going to be about global sourcing and trying to give you maybe some tips about to-dos and don'ts in this particular space, talking about some best practices if you want to engage on global sourcing type programs. So just quickly, a few words about Dragon Sourcing so you get a sense about who we are and what we do. But in essence, we do what we call Procurement Intelligence. We have a team focused in India that really is focused more on market research, providing marketing departments information that helps them make more effective, more informed buying decisions. We do, of course, global sourcing. This is where we help our clients to identify, to qualify, and to manage suppliers in emerging markets. We also do procurement outsourcing, again, in these emerging markets, so we can also act as an international buying office for our clients in some of these geographies. And then we also do, in some cases, some consulting work. That's the last bullet point there on this page, what we call here Procurement Capability Enhancement. This is where we go into a procurement organization to evaluate its performance and make potential recommendations about how they could improve. On the Procurement Intelligence, on this page, you just get a feel for the kind of reports we can issue for our clients, but they revolve around discovering market opportunities for the clients, around helping the buying organizations make better informed buying decisions, and it's also around helping clients managing and mitigating supply chain risks. So I'm not going to spend too much time on that, but just to give you an overall feel for the kind of work we do there. On the sourcing work, which is the bulk of what we do, we basically run the whole sourcing process end to end. I've laid out here the three key stages we usually go through. We go through an initial stage of, it's called here supplier pre-qualification. It could be called a bit like a feasibility study. The idea here is for particular categories of interest for a client, we would do a deep dive analysis of the supply market in new markets, in, let's say, in China or in India or in Vietnam or what have you, in order to make a determination as to whether an opportunity might or might not exist for that category in that market. So it's very traditional work around, of course, understanding the demand of the client, identifying suppliers, doing some initial phone screening of these suppliers, running RFIs, running RFQs, profiling suppliers' capabilities, analyzing quotations, all this kind of work in order to get a sense as to whether an opportunity might or might not exist for that particular category in those new supply markets. If following that initial piece of work, it seems like an opportunity might exist, so the focus of the second stage, called here selection and contracting, is to actually try to make that opportunity happen. So here it's about qualifying the suppliers and qualifying the products. So it's about auditing suppliers to ensure that all the information we've collected about them are confirmed through our visits into the facilities. It's about, of course, testing whether they can make compliant products that meet the client specifications. And then finally, of course, it's about entering into contract negotiations to see if we can agree terms and conditions. And then again, if we're successful at the back end of that stage, we can get involved in the whole fulfillment, or what we call here procurement operations, ensuring that orders being placed with those newly qualified suppliers are produced and delivered in time, in quantity, and in quality. So it's quality control, booking logistics, paying suppliers, resolving any kind of supply chain issues that might occur. So that's the scope of work that we provide. We really try to cover most of the important emerging markets. In red, you can see the markets which we operate into from a supply perspective, from a buying perspective. In green, you can see the key markets where we're operating more on the sales side, where most of our customers are. So we're hoping that the Nairobi spot there, which for the moment is red, is going to turn green. If we can, with the help of Bernard, get some accounts in East Africa. But so you can see that we really try to cover most of the important emerging markets, be it in Asia, in East and Central Europe, in a little bit more of Africa now. It's raising its profile over the last few years, and getting more attention from clients that are thinking about sourcing from Africa. And Latin American countries, particularly Mexico, which is quite important for the North American market. So that's it about drug and sourcing. So let's kind of dive into the focus of this particular webinar, which are, based on our experience of running global sourcing programs for our clients for many years, what we have observed in terms of good practices in this particular space. So if we go back to this very kind of simplistic view of the sourcing process, broken down into those three phases, the kind of initial opportunity analysis, the supply selection and contracting, and the procurement operations. We've laid down here some of the key steps that you systematically have to go through if you want to run one of these programs. And at different stages of this process, you've got to keep, a few tips in mind to make sure that you don't trip over and fail in the initiative that you're launching. So the first thing to be very aware of is at the very beginning of the process, when you select categories for a global sourcing program, you've got to make sure that you have a complete data set of that particular category, that you have a complete understanding of what items are included in this particular category. For each item, that you have a full set of specifications and drawings and pictures, sometimes samples available, a good understanding of how you would expect quality control to be conducted, logistics requirements, whatever regulations might exist to import this product into your country. It's really very, very important to get started with a very complete data set, because if you don't, if you get started with an incomplete set or an incorrect set with not only missing information, but maybe incorrect information, which can happen quite frequently, then of course, when you go out to the supply market, you try to collect potential quotations for your products. If it's based on either incomplete or incorrect information, then of course, the quotations which you're going to be getting back are not going to be reliable. And so you might be making some decisions based on quotations you're getting, which will be invalidated later on in the process when you suddenly discover that you maybe have not provided the supplier all of the information he should have had, and suddenly the quotation which looked attractive initially, a few months later, is no longer attractive. So when you launch one of these exercises, be absolutely sure that you're able internally to collect all of the necessary data to make sure suppliers have a full understanding of your requirements. The second step is once you've decided which countries you want to even start looking into, is to identify potential suppliers. Now, if it's a new category, you've not worked in this category before in a particular country, well, then you've got to try to build a database of potential suppliers. And the key here is to really be comprehensive and exhaustive in your research. Because, of course, if at the beginning of the process, you don't identify a supplier which has the characteristics to potentially become one of the attractive suppliers to your business, if he's not part of your process at the beginning, when you identify suppliers, he, of course, by definition, will never be part of your pool of suppliers at the end of the process. So it's very, very important to really spend the necessary time and to tap into all of the available public information in order to identify all the potential suppliers and to create a long list of suppliers that is as comprehensive as possible to make sure you don't miss out on some potential company that could be extremely attractive to your procurement department. So that's the step number 2. Then, if we continue, I'm sorry, just to go a bit fast here. If you continue into the process, once you've identified the suppliers, you go, of course, through the RFI, RFQ process. I'm sure you're all familiar with RFI, RFQ, request for information and quotation. You collect a lot of information about those suppliers. Once you've collected it, you analyze all of the information about those suppliers. So when we run RFIs, we're collecting information about their financials, about their production capacity, about their quality certifications, about their customer references, about their compliance to social responsibility. I mean, there's a lot of things that we have to collect about the suppliers in the RFI process, and of course, the quotation process to collect their price points for your particular requirement. So this is the next step in the process. Once you've identified the suppliers, to run the RFI, run the RFQ, and to analyze all of that data in a way that allows you to profile the suppliers and to rank them in terms of attractiveness. So at the end of this initial phase, the opportunity analysis phase, you maybe started off with a long list of suppliers of 150 suppliers. At the end of the RFI, RFQ process, you want to identify maybe 4 or 5 or 6 suppliers, maximum, that appear to be potentially the most attractive for you. So once you get to the second stage of the process, it becomes then critical to go and audit those 5 or 6 suppliers, because the way you're doing this work, it's all done initially from a distance. When you're running an RFI, RFQ process, you're basically dependent on getting suppliers to provide you with accurate information. But most of the information that you're collecting is done on a self-declaration basis from the suppliers. You can, of course, try to make some checks, looking at their websites, maybe talking to some of their customers. Some checks can be done remotely, but by and large, you're highly dependent on the quality of the information which the suppliers have been willing to provide you. And so, of course, it is not possible to be reliant only on information being provided by the suppliers. So it's critical to go and audit suppliers that have responded to your RFI, RFQ, and particularly the ones which, based on the responses that you have received, appear to be very attractive. And so auditing suppliers, going to visit their facilities, talking to their management, reviewing key documentation about their business is a critical stage of this process, because, again, many companies, they go on Alibaba or they try to collect information from a distance, and then they believe they have a reliable supplier. They sometimes make the mistake of placing orders without making further checks. And there's lots of horror stories that I can tell you about insufficient due diligence being made, and either products never coming out of that supplier, or products of insufficient quality that, of course, do not meet the client's requirements. So auditing is absolutely essential to ensure that all the information that you have collected in the RFI, RFQ stage is confirmed through your visit, ensuring thereby that the suppliers do have the capability to meet your requirements. If the audits are good, then of course the next step in the process is to make sure that you're asking them to make samples and for you to test those samples so that you can of course reassure yourselves that they are actually capable of making a compliant product. So again, a critical stage of the process not to skip. You've got to get samples, review those samples, test them thoroughly to ensure compliance to your requirements. If the suppliers are passing the audits, if the suppliers have demonstrated their ability to make compliant samples, then you start moving to what we've called here final negotiations with those suppliers that have passed these different stages. And here you run into another risk. Because depending on the industry that you're working in, for instance, if you take the automotive industry, the time it can take to actually test a sample from a new supplier can sometimes be extremely lengthy. You know, if you're in the automotive industry, it can sometimes take as long as 12 months for automotive companies to carry out thorough, comprehensive testing of products coming out from new potential suppliers. So throughout this 1 year period, you know, lots of things can happen. Macro changes can happen, be it in currencies or in transportation costs or in overall supply and demand, or a recession can start hitting particular markets, or as we're seeing today, a virus can come in and disrupt the whole supply chain. So for all of these macro reasons, the quote that you had received at the end of the RFI, RFQ stage might be very different 6, 9, 12 months later for all of these reasons. Or what might also happen is that suppliers had given you quotes based on some partial understanding of how difficult it might be to make your product. And finally, after having been through the whole product development and testing phase, only then do they fully understand the detailed requirements of how it is, or what is required to make this particular product. And the suppliers are forced to come back with a higher quote. And this happens quite frequently, that you come up with a good business case at the beginning of your process, at the end of the opportunity analysis, but several months later, if the development process for making samples and testing them is quite lengthy and complex, it can happen quite frequently that suppliers come back to you. You say, well, I'm sorry, but I thought I could make this particular product for 100, but actually it's no longer possible. The quote right now is 125. And this, of course, can invalidate the whole business case because, of course, you had premised the notion of selecting this supplier on the basis that he was maybe providing you with 20% savings. And suddenly the quote is 25% higher. All of the savings have disappeared. So you just have to be wary and conscious about this. You know, many companies are declaring victory at the end of the RFI, RFQ process. In many cases, they're declaring victory far too early for the reasons I've just described. The audits can be bad, and suppliers that look good, unfortunately, have to be discarded. And even when the audits are good, suppliers had underestimated what it would take to make compliant samples. And once they fully understand, suddenly the quotation is no longer what it used to be. Now, assuming none of this happens, and that at the end of the auditing process, at the end of the sample development and testing process, everything still looks good, and that you're still having 25, 35% savings compared to your current costs. There's one practice which you have to be very, very wary of. It's called here back leveraging. Back leveraging is a temptation which every procurement department has. And it basically means that what they're doing is they've now qualified, let's say, a new supplier, let's say in India. You've got suppliers in Kenya. You've launched one of these exercises looking for new suppliers, let's say in India. You've been through all of the steps I've described here, and you have been successful at qualifying a new supplier that is 25% cheaper than your current supplier in Kenya. Well, the temptation of many procurement departments is to go back to their existing suppliers, to their incumbent suppliers, and say, look, we have a new supplier qualified in India. They have offered us 25% reduction compared to the price you're charging us. We're inviting you to reduce your price, or you will lose the business. And quite frequently, incumbent suppliers will not necessarily bridge the whole gap. So if there's a gap of 25%, okay, they might come back to the client and say, okay, we'll give you a 10% reduction, maybe a 15% reduction, but they'll give you something. And quite often, unfortunately, the buyers will be tempted to take that offer because, of course, they get the 10% immediately. There is no risk to the business because, of course, it's the incumbent supplier who understands how to operate a particular supply base, that's a particular supply chain. And the temptation is quite big to take the 10% and just move on and forget about the newly qualified supplier in India. This is called back leveraging. Many companies do it. It provides benefit in the short term, you get the 10%, but it is bad practice for the medium to longer term because, of course, if you continuously do this kind of approach, the word will go out. Suppliers in India will find out that you actually are not really a serious buyer. You're only in the market to try to put pressure on your incumbent suppliers, but have no real serious strategic intent to change your supply chain and to potentially place orders with new suppliers in India. So next time around when you're going to try that same exercise again, suppliers will no longer be responding. And you would have kind of built yourself a bad reputation in the supply market. So you get a short-term benefit, but to the detriment of having leverage into the future by having qualified suppliers in alternative markets working for you. That's a very, very important thing to keep in mind. This notion of having really a strategic supply base that is not all focused in a particular region of the world. What I even say to my clients, it can happen, if we go back to the issue of, you had a 25% case study at the end of the RFQ process. Then you launch the qualification stage, auditing, sampling. It takes you 6 months. 6 months later, the world has changed. You had 25% savings 6 months ago. 6 months later, for a variety of reasons, raw materials have gone up, transportation costs have changed, currency has evolved. All kinds of things have happened, and the 25% is now only 5% advantage from the new supplier. There again, many procurement departments have the reflex to say, oh, for 5%, I am not going to change supplier. That's too risky. I'm buying from Kenya, I'm buying from France, I'm buying from North America. Too risky to go and buy from China. Well, I tell the clients that could be a very strategic mistake, a bad mistake that you're making, because admittedly, the savings is today only a 5% savings. But the reasons which have caused the 25% that you had previously to change to 5% could very well in 6 months from now re-change again. And the 5% could very easily re-become a minus 25%. So if you've given up on the supplier in China, if you go back 6 months, 12 months later, when you've realized that your costs have increased in your local market, to go and actually try to execute on the buy in China, well, unfortunately, it'll be too late because you have not developed that relationship with the supplier. And so that supplier, will no longer have a motivation or be ready to actually sell to you. So you also have to keep in mind the strategic value of having suppliers balanced in different regions of the world that you can activate and that you're working with, so that whenever there is some macro balances that are changing in the world, currencies, transportation, raw materials, overall supply and demand, you have supply that are qualified that you've been working with in regions of the world that can actually provide you value. Not necessarily today, but it's an anticipation of what they might basically be able to do for you in the future. So it's important to keep this mindset, not to be too focused on immediate savings, but to try to take a longer term, more strategic perspective. Then assuming that you actually do start working with these new suppliers, you don't do the back leveraging, you've decided to place orders with them and to start including them in your supply chain, then you move now to the procurement operations. So this is again a new supplier. So they've demonstrated their ability to support your business in terms of making a valid sample. But making a valid sample is not necessarily the same thing as making valid products in mass production. And so it's absolutely critical that when you start placing orders for full containers with that new supplier, that you put in place very rigorous quality control, so that before the products are loaded on the container, that a thorough, detailed quality control is carried out at the supplier's premises to ensure that in production, not only the sample was good when he was making the sample, but that now in production, that the products being actually made and planned to be delivered to you are also compliant to the specification. So that's absolutely critical. For our clients, we make sure that every single container is quality controlled before the goods are loaded onto the container. Doing a good quality control process is also an art of itself. You have to understand what parameters you want to control, what tolerances you can provide. So that in itself, to carry out a proper quality control is something that you need to think through very carefully to make sure that you're capturing all of the key dimensions of the product. So that's really, if you're thinking about this whole process that I've just described, some of the key issues that can occur when you're running the process that you really have to keep in mind when you launch one of these exercises. So in summary, as we go along the various steps of the sourcing process, the first one, what we call the demand analysis or the requirements analysis, be comprehensive in your data collection. Make sure that you have comprehensive data about your categories, the specs, the volumes, the logistics requirements, the regulations, everything, to make sure that you can represent this thing properly to the suppliers. The second point here, test actual products against specifications. This might sound a bit strange, but it's quite frequent, particularly depending on the industry you're in. But you take the retail space, for instance, retailers very often are not buying what they think they're buying. If you're looking at the spec they're sending you, and then if you test the products that are in their stores, you will very frequently detect differences between the product in the store and what they believe they were buying. Why is that happening? It's happening because first, retailers have thousands and thousands of SKUs in their stores. They tend to be very aggressive buyers, putting extreme pressure on their suppliers to reduce costs and to reduce price. And what do the manufacturers do? The suppliers basically, what are they gradually doing? They gradually degrade the quality of the product without the client always noticing. And it's very, very frequent that, you know, the buyers are under the belief that they're buying a particular specification, only to find out later on that that is not the case. But of course, this is very critical to know, because if you launch one of these exercises using your specifications, using your drawings, you go out there and ask for quotation from suppliers. The quotations are going to come against those specifications. You know, if you have a plastic bag for your store, you're specifying a certain thickness of the bag. The supplier, he's going to quote on that thickness. Well, if the actual bag that you're buying doesn't have that thickness, if it's a thinner bag, but you don't actually know it's thinner, the quotation you're going to get is never going to be attractive, because the new suppliers are quoting for a thickness which your existing supplier is not providing. So, you know, this happens in particular industries. If you're in a highly engineered industry, this will never happen. If you're in the automotive industry, the specifications, the drawing are extremely rigorous, of course. It's impossible that the drawings are not going to be reflecting of the product that you're buying. But if you were in the retail business, if you're in the services business, if you're buying indirect materials, things of that nature, quite frequently, you have to expect that the specs can be different from the actual product that you're buying. So be aware of that, because this can derail your entire program. In the supply identification, I had indicated to cast a wide net. Make sure that you are very thorough in identifying potential suppliers, because again, if you don't identify a potential winner at the beginning of the process, by definition, you can't have him at the back end of the process. Audits, like I said, critical to audit suppliers to ensure that all the information you've collected about them is confirmed. But you also have to be ready to engage in supply development. It is possible that after the audit, you've come to the conclusion that this supplier is not fully up to what you're looking for, but the gap between what it is you're looking for in terms of capabilities and what he has is not that big. And so what you need to then do, as opposed to giving up on the supplier, is to engage in supply development. Help the supplier understand the gap he has between what he should be operating at and what he's currently doing, and potentially even help him bridge that gap so that eventually he can become a supplier of yours. Sample testing, do it quickly and get the key internal customers involved in the process very quickly. Why am I saying do it quickly? Because of course, quite often you are dependent on other people in your organization to carry out these tests. Let's assume you want to run, you know, you're buying plastic film, talking about plastic packaging before, plastic film for wrapping your products. Well, the way to test plastic film is to run it through your machines. Now, production people are not always hyper motivated to run samples, rolls from new suppliers on their machines to test whether those rolls are functioning properly on their machines. It's having them waste time on their machines. So, you know, the temptation can be for these people to wait and wait and wait for weeks and weeks before they test the product. If that happens, you know, you're just kind of losing momentum in the whole process. And the suppliers get demotivated, they feel you're not serious about the program, and slowly but surely, you know, the whole initiative unravels because, you know, there's just lack of momentum, lack of pressure to make things happen. So make sure from the very beginning, if you launch one of these programs, and if you anticipate that you're going to need the support from internal people in your organization to test these products, once you've decided which suppliers you want to select for sampling, get them involved from the very beginning. Show them the business case. Show them the potential savings. Get top management involved if you're still having difficulties to ensure that you're not kind of spinning your wheels for weeks and sometimes months before you get support internally to get these particular products tested. Final negotiation and supplier selection, no back leveraging. The temptation is there, it is bad practice. What you can do, once you've qualified a new supplier, if that new supplier is, let's say at minus 25% compared to your incumbent, what you can do, which is good practice, is to reorganize a tender. You then say to your incumbent suppliers, you say to your newly qualified suppliers, I am now re-tendering the business between the incumbents and the newly qualified. And then you let those suppliers compete on a level playing field for that business. And depending on the outcome of that new tender, then you make your decision. As opposed to just going back to your incumbent, telling him I've got a minus 25% better offer, give me minus 10 and I'll stay with you. That is bad practice. Reorganizing a tender, making it transparent, giving the newly qualified supplier a real opportunity to get the business is good practice. And then quality control, I indicated, very important to do it and to be very comprehensive in what you include in what is called a quality protocol. Because if, of course, you're not controlling all of the parameters of the product that you should be controlling, you still expose yourself to bad products being delivered. And then you can, of course, do it in process, i.e. during production. You don't necessarily have to wait for the end of the production. But definitely, particularly if it's a new supplier, you have to organize pre-shipment QC to ensure that the products are in compliance with your requirements. I'm going to go quickly here. So these were some tips on what I call the functional side. On the process side, like I said, you have to take a strategic approach, not a tactical approach. You know, maybe you have a quote from a supplier, the savings doesn't appear to be that big, but you say to yourself, from a longer term perspective, I need to have suppliers qualified in Asia. I need to have suppliers qualified in Africa. I need to have suppliers maybe qualified in North America, so that, you know, I can play with macroeconomic conditions and leverage those conditions to my advantage. Sell your buy to the suppliers. I've mentioned here the Chinese suppliers here, because of course they are critical and have been, of course, very critical in this global supply market. But whichever market you're operating into, you sometimes have to sell your buy. Sometimes your buyers, you know, buyers have to be salespeople. If you go into these supply markets, the high quality suppliers are in high demand. They are not out there desperate for new business. By definition, good suppliers tend to have good customers and tend to have good capacity utilization. Not as good suppliers tend, of course, to be out there looking for business. Especially if you're in a seller's market, where, you know, like for instance today, in the whole PPE supply market, you know, the masks and the gloves and the gowns, all of these things which the world is looking for now to try to protect themselves against the virus. We are in a typical seller's market. Prices are going through the roof. Suppliers are allocating volumes to their customers based on relationships and longer term perspective. Trying to go into this market today and buying masks and things of this nature without a longer term perspective and without your ability to sell to that buyer, to that supplier, a longer term vision, explaining to him that, of course, very short term, the market is a seller's market, but eventually things will calm down. Eventually that he's going to be looking for longer term relationships for secure volumes. You know, building a story like that, selling your business to a particular supplier can sometimes be extremely critical in order to get in and to have access to attractive capacity. An enterprise-wide approach, like I was saying before, you know, if it's just procurement, running these programs in isolation, it's going to hit all kind of roadblocks. All types of resistance internally when decisions are going to have to be made about changing suppliers. Very often there are more challenges internally in your own organizations to achieve success than there are challenges in the supply markets. So it's very important from the beginning to get top management support and to get key stakeholders to participate into the process. People from production, people from quality, sometimes depending on the product, people from marketing and sales. You have to look at it on a case-by-case basis, depending on the categories, and really build a multifunctional team that will understand what this particular program is all about. I'm going to skip this one. And then if you want to get started, in your portfolio of categories, of course, start with the ones which are lower risk categories. Don't start with categories which are critical for your entire supply chain, where if something goes wrong, your entire supply chain will be disrupted. So do some good, careful analysis in the beginning to pick categories that probably have some higher potential and that pose lower risk to the business if something was to go wrong whenever you're going to switch from your existing suppliers to new suppliers. And then, yes, this last particular point, it's not because you're operating in, but I shouldn't be saying this to you in Kenya. I mean, this particular message is more geared toward Western companies in Western Europe and North America. Very often when they operate in China or in India or in Vietnam, they believe that maybe they should operate a different sourcing process, that it's maybe more about relationships and, well, I hate to use the word, networks of people that you might or might not know and hidden incentives and things like that. Of course, these kind of bad practices can occur, but by and large, when you operate in all of these markets, it's the same rigor, the same discipline, the same transparency that you need to adopt when you're working in France or in Germany or in America or what have you. You've got to go through exactly the same transparent, rigorous, fact-based process to ensure honesty into the process. So that's really it in terms of what I wanted to say. I had a small case study behind here, but I'm just wary of the time. It's already, what time is it already? It's nearly already 7 p.m. for you. So what I would recommend is maybe that I pause here. And if people have any particular questions that they want to raise, then I think that might be a better use of the time we have than going through the case study.
All right, thank you, Richard, for your thoughts on this. We have a few questions. One is from Andrew Ashene, who says, there was emphasis on the pitfalls of back leveraging. Is this a weak link in the procurement practice, inferred from experience? It's a good point, and I appreciate the learning.
I don't know if it's a question or just a reinforcement of what I was saying, but yeah, I mean, you're all, I guess the people that are participating on this call are all, I suspect, procurement professionals. So they probably know what I'm talking about. There is this high temptation. It is, of course, very understandable. You have an incumbent supplier. There's a relationship that you've established with that incumbent sometimes for years. Things are running smoothly. If you can get 10% immediately at no risk versus minus 20% where there is a switching required, which of course brings an element of risk to it, undoubtedly the temptation is big. But okay, it's not something I recommend. A much better practice is what I was describing before. Reorganize a new tender between your incumbents, between your newly qualified suppliers, make it transparent, make it honest, And based on the new tender, that's when you start making decisions about who's going to get the business.
Okay, so linked to that, Masinda asks, at what point is back leveraging allowed or justified within the procurement process?
Well, allowed, every business has to decide, of course, how they want to run their business. So allowed it is. There's nothing which makes it illegal of any kind, of course. Anybody can do it. I just would never do it. If you've done a good sourcing work, the whole sourcing process I've described was focused on getting yourself in a position where the new supplier is truly qualified, i.e. he's in a position where you should have really no reasons to be concerned to place an order with him. If that is the position, I would see no justification for back leveraging. The way to do it is to say, okay, I now have a pool of qualified suppliers, which is comprised of my pool of incumbents, to which I have now added maybe a couple of newly qualified suppliers. This is my new pool of qualified suppliers, and it's within that pool of suppliers that I'm now going to run my tenders, and I'm going to be indifferent as to who I'm going to be giving the business to. It's going to be the tender will decide who gets the business.
Okay, so Chris says, thank you, Richard, for the presentation. The approach outlined is likely to work more for private sector procurement as opposed to the public sector. What has been your experience for large-scale public sector players?
Yeah, admittedly, the public sector is a bit different to the private sector, because of course there's a whole set of regulations and compliance issues which public procurement people have to adhere to. But having said that, we've worked also less frequently. I would say 95% of the work we do is for the private sector. But I would say that the fundamental principle that I've laid out here are not radically different if you're operating in the public sector. But of course, in the public sector, you have to be willing to open up, the supply base to, quite frequently in the public sector, there's a tendency of wanting to give the business to local suppliers or national suppliers or whatever, the geographic dimension is. In Europe, of course, there are regulations which says that you cannot favor, let's assume you're running a public tender in France, you have to give an equal opportunity to all EU suppliers, not necessarily French suppliers. But there will be, of course, a tendency to give, even though you can't really do it, but there will be a tendency to sometimes, favor French suppliers compared to an Italian supplier or a Finnish supplier or a Polish supplier. So that's what I observe quite frequently in public tenders. It's not sometimes as transparent as they would want us to believe it is. But other than that, the fundamental, if they really want to run it transparently and they really want to run it honestly and give everybody a level playing field, the key principle that I've laid out here should apply also in the public sector.
Okay, I think Ronald would like to ask a question. Ronald Sang, you can go ahead.
He needs to unmute himself, I think.
Yes, hello. Good afternoon.
Hi, Ronald.
How are you?
I'm just fine, and yourself?
My question is actually when we try to relate between the private sector and the public sector, there are those particular things that we do, especially when it comes to the arena of global sourcing, which actually we can regard to global sourcing when you skip the issue of auditing on your suppliers. What are those particular risks that you are likely to encounter?
Well, the same risk as you would have in the private sector. If you don't audit the supplier, For instance, if you have regulations in the public sector that you cannot buy from suppliers that do not comply with particular CSR requirements, social responsibility issues. Well, I mean, if you don't order that supplier for compliance to social responsibility parameter that you have, you could be placing orders with a supplier that is not in compliance with those requirements. Maybe they might have some child labor or environmental issues or whatever, that unless you audit them in detail, you will not basically be able to detect properly.
Okay.
Michael here says or asks, during COVID scenario, it's impossible to get complete data sets, especially with COVID management supplies from both sides. What's your experience on this? And how do we go about, getting that complete data in light of COVID-19?
And can you just clarify what you mean by data? What data are we talking about?
Remember you talked about getting a complete data set at the beginning.
From your categories.
Yeah.
I don't see why COVID would have any influence on your ability to collect internally what specifications you're buying. I mean,
True.
So either you have the data internally or you don't. I'm saying this because, sometimes when you're working, we do some global source programs for companies that have maybe 20, 25, 30 factories all over the world. And all these factories are buying the same category. So let's assume we pick one category and they want all of these factories in the world to participate into the program. So now, of course, we need to collect data from 25 factories. Some companies are extremely well organized around their data. They have central data warehouses where all of this information is deposited, and they can just query the warehouse, the data warehouse, and in a matter of a couple of hours, collect all of the spend information. Other companies don't have that. They have separate systems. Every factory is run a little independently. And to collect the data, you have to go to each of these individual factories, specify the information you need, start collecting it and consolidating it. And this could be a very complex and massive exercise. So it's got nothing to do with COVID. It's got to do with what the quality of the data that you have internally and your ability to access that data rapidly.
Okay, interesting thought. Rhoda asks, how do you manage quality from overseas when you are not physically there? Sometimes photos look good, but the product is not what is brought.
Well, that's why I was saying that you have to organize a quality control to be performed before the goods are shipped out. So what happens is that, once a supplier has finished his production, before he loads the goods onto the container in his factory, you've got to send out quality control. You have to send out quality controllers in the factory. They will apply what is called AQL techniques. AQL is a statistical technique to select a sample set up, because of course, let's assume you're making 50,000 widgets. The guy who's going in to do quality control cannot control all the 50,000 widgets. He'd be spending the next months doing that. So he has to pick randomly a subset of the 50,000 and then conduct a quality control on all of those. Let's assume he picks maybe 200 widgets out of the 50,000, totally randomly. And then he will test those 200 widgets on what has been agreed in terms of what criteria need to be tested. Dimensions, color, mechanical strengths, stretching ability, whatever it is that this product needs to comply with, all of those parameters will need to be tested on those 200 widgets. And depending on the outcome of the testing done on those 200 widgets, the quality control will be considered either a fail or a pass. If it's a fail, then of course the goods don't get loaded in a container, and the supplier has to rework the products until a quality control is reperformed. And only once the quality control is a pass will the goods be allowed on the container and shipped out.
Okay. So I'm wary of time, and so I'll just ask the last two questions, but in form of one question. So Josephine is asking, with the threat of COVID-19, where is global sourcing headed, given that China was largely affected? It's just coming back into operation. And tied to that is there any area of green global sourcing as a contemporary issue in supply chain management?
So where is it headed? It's a good question because, China, the behavior of China in this whole virus situation is highly questionable. Some people, and I might even be part of some of those people, would go as far as to say that it's been criminal. Why would I say that, and why would some people say that? It's because they've done things which have impacted the whole world, and the ability of the whole world to react appropriately to the danger associated with this virus. I'm not going to go through the whole list, but the worst thing they've done is that when they decided the lockdown of the Hebei province, it all started in Wuhan. Wuhan is the capital city of a province called Hebei. On January 22nd, they decided a full lockdown of the Hebei province from and to that province to the rest of China. But what they did not do is enact that lockdown for the rest of the world. Wuhan had an international airport. Well, hundreds of thousands of Chinese people were allowed to fly out of China to the rest of the world, particularly, of course, to Western Europe, North America, where there's a lot of business interaction between, but I suspect also to some extent into Africa, knowingly from the Chinese authorities that a not insignificant percentage of those people were infected and were therefore going to infect the other people in the rest of the world. So whilst they were putting a locking system, a lockdown system to protect the rest of China, they, for reasons which, everybody will have to decide for themselves, allowed hundreds of thousands of Chinese to travel to the rest of the world and infect the rest of the world. It's unconscionable behavior. Now, because of that, it has created huge political tensions between China and North America, between China and Australia, between China and Eastern and Western Europe, to the point where I think the rest of the world is now rethinking very, very, very seriously the nature of the Chinese regime. And so I'm saying all this because I do anticipate that there will be, once this particular crisis is over, whenever that is, there will be some very serious rethinking about this entire supply chain thinking. At the very least, I suspect the Americans and the Europeans are going to repatriate some significant sectors that have been outsourced to the Chinese. I'm talking particularly around the pharmaceutical industry, the PPE industry, and a few others, where over the last 20, 25 years, most of the capacity has been now moved to China, to a lesser extent to India. I suspect that they will take significant steps to repatriate those entire supply chains away from China, back into Western Europe, into North America, into Australia. I'm seeing many American companies now coming to us that are very, very upset about what has happened and are deliberately now looking for suppliers outside of China, even if they have to pay a higher price. Even if they have to pay a higher price, because they're now extremely disgruntled about the behavior of the Chinese, very concerned about what could happen in terms of country risk with China into the future. And so even not only at the country level, not only at the governmental level, where I think significant decisions will be taken, I think at the company level as well, companies are going to think very, very strongly about their decisions and their strategies around global sourcing. And I suspect they're going to start looking to shift volumes away from China. It's not easy, of course, because that capacity is installed. The Chinese supply chain is extremely effective. Not only about, it's not only about labor cost. There's a lot of other issues that the Chinese have, of course, honed in very expertly over the last 20 years. So that shift is going to take time. It's going to be costly, but I do believe it will happen. I do believe it will happen. So I do anticipate that there will be significant shifts away from China, either to other supply markets in the emerging markets, or back home, back into Western Europe, back into North America, as a result of what has happened with this particular virus. And of course, this has huge implications because this will create spare capacity in China. The Chinese suppliers are going to be looking, if this actually does occur, for alternative supplier selling markets, alternative customers, to replace reduced volumes into Western Europe, reduced volume into North America. Given the fact that 90% of their volumes are going into those markets, it's going to be, of course, not possible for them to replace it totally, but it will offer great opportunities for companies maybe in Kenya, where maybe the Chinese suppliers or other suppliers might not have treated the African market with as much strategic intent as they have the West European and North American market. They might take a very different perspective, particularly when one looks at the rise of Africa in terms of economic power that is anticipated for the next 10, 15, 20 years. They might very well take a very different perspective. And this could offer, I think, maybe great opportunities for companies in Africa to think carefully and tap into that opportunity that the Chinese suppliers might actually offer them.
Okay, they say Africa is the new frontier. So let's wait and see how that pans out. Thank you so much, Richard, for your great insights.
Yep.
I can see lots of positive comments around, the presentation. And what we will do is, if you don't mind, that we will share the presentation on the House of Procurement website, so that then members can be able to access and be able to read what has been presented today. So allow me to invite Ben to just give some closing remarks, and then we can all have a good evening thereafter.
Yes, so it was a pleasure for me to attend this webinar. I would appreciate, if there is some kind of a process plan to capture the feedback in terms of people's satisfaction or lack of satisfaction with what was presented. That would be, of course, very useful feedback for me.
Okay, so Ben, are you still with us?
Yes. Thank you very much, Rose. Thank you, Richard. Thank you, everyone who has participated. I think sourcing and global or local sourcing, whatever it is, and at what level we're doing it, is very important for us. And taking that initiative. From here, I pick out the issue of back leveraging. This is very common. In the private sector, actually, we are very old suppliers, because we don't want to really go out and search and go through the whole process. Sometimes the process seems tiring, but I think the only way we sit on the table is when we are able to deliver to organizations 20, 25, 15% plus savings. I've always said, if you have one supplier for 10 years who keeps on giving you 10% each year, how comes you're not at zero at this point? It's probably this means this supplier has been charging you 200% because of your risk averseness. and that back leveraging issue, you miss on the opportunity to impact on the profit. The other one was an internal alignment and getting in the right stakeholders. In our last webinar, we were told that supply chain people have not signed up to change the world, but this is an opportunity to start thinking ahead, start thinking of solutions that will help our organizations, our departments in across the different categories, and come with those ideas. Just being prepared for any shift in China is staying ahead. The relationship engagement, reminding the suppliers in the world that COVID-19 will pass and it's a long-term relationship, and leading the conversation will be key. So thank you for attending. The presentation will be available. We have many other resources with Dragon Sourcing are available. Anyone who wants a direct conversation with Richard can reach out to me. I will be able to organize that. Have a good evening and God bless you.
Thank you all. Have a good evening.